If the United States ever launches the ground invasion of Iran, the first question any serious analyst must ask is not whether American forces can win the opening battles. They almost certainly would, but rather where exactly that army gets trapped. Because most people imagine war as something fast and decisive. They imagine tanks racing across deserts, fighter jets dominating the sky, and within weeks the capital falls and the enemy government collapses. That is the picture people still carry from the invasion of Iraq in 2003, when American forces reached Baghdad in just 3 weeks. But the situation with Iran is completely different, and the trap waiting for any invading force is not theoretical. The trap is geography. The trap is logistics. The trap is politics. And once American ground forces move into this environment, the exit doors start closing very quickly. First, understand the scale of the battlefield. Iran is an enormous country covering more than 1.6 million square kilometers. That is larger than Iraq and Afghanistan combined. And anyone who remembers how difficult those 2 wars became should pause and consider what that number means for a military occupation. It means controlling a territory that stretches from scorching deserts to towering mountain chains, from crowded urban centers to remote villages where supply roads are almost non-existent and where central authority has always been weak. Even during the 20-year war in Afghanistan, American forces struggled to control a much smaller country with far fewer people and a far less organized military. Iran has more than 85 million citizens, a large professional military, and a deep historical memory of foreign invasion. That memory does not weaken resistance. It hardens it. Think carefully about how such an invasion will even begin. Where do the troops come from? Where do they land? Where do they stage the operation and build the supply infrastructure before pushing forward? The United States cannot simply teleport 500,000 soldiers into the center of Iran. They have to deploy somewhere first, establish massive logistical hubs, and then begin pushing forces forward. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq staged largely from Kuwait and from American bases scattered across the Gulf region. But the political environment today is dramatically different. Iraq now has a government closely connected with Iran, a government that has repeatedly stated that Iraqi territory cannot be used as a staging ground for an attack against its neighbor. If American forces tried to use Iraqi bases for a major invasion, it would trigger enormous political backlash inside Iraq itself, potentially destabilizing a country that America spent 2 decades and trillions of dollars trying to build. Look north and the picture is no more encouraging. Could American forces stage from Turkey? Technically, Turkey is a NATO member, which might suggest automatic cooperation, but Ankara has its own complex strategic interests, and Turkish leadership has consistently shown it will not allow its territory to become a launch pad for wars that might send Iranian missiles flying toward Turkish cities or destabilize Turkish trade routes. This means one obvious invasion corridor is restricted and another is politically unavailable. What remains? Naval forces and Gulf bases. The United States could launch operations from aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf and from installations in Qatar and Bahrain. But this creates an immediate and severe problem. Supply lines. Every single soldier on a modern battlefield requires constant resupply. Food, water, ammunition, spare parts, medical equipment, fuel, batteries, all of it must travel hundreds or thousands of miles across sea lanes and through narrow choke points that are extremely vulnerable to disruption. Iran has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. Its military strategy does not require defeating the United States in a head-on conventional engagement. Instead, the strategy focuses on making the battlefield so painful, so costly, and so politically unbearable that the invading force eventually loses the will to continue. Iranian missile forces, drone units, and naval fast attack boats operating in the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf can target shipping routes and supply convoys. Even limited disruption forces supply chains to slow down, reroute, or halt entirely. And when logistics begin breaking down, an army quickly loses its ability to project force, sustain operations, and maintain the morale of the soldiers doing the fighting. Geography is where the physical trap becomes impossible to ignore. Look at the western side of Iran on any topographical map, and you immediately see the massive Zagros mountain range stretching hundreds of miles across the country. These are not gentle hills. They are steep, rugged mountains with narrow valleys, unpredictable weather, and countless natural choke points, where a small defending force positioned on high ground can stop a large armored column completely. Heavy vehicles cannot maneuver freely in this terrain. Convoys are forced onto predictable roads, and predictability on battlefield is fatal. For more than 2 decades, Iran has invested heavily in underground facilities, tunnel networks, and pre-positioned weapons caches throughout these mountains. Not emergency defenses built in a panic, but deliberate systems constructed with a patient expectation that one day a foreign army might attempt to cross these passes. Consider what happens in practical terms when a military convoy enters a narrow mountain pass. The vehicles stretch out along the road because there is no physical space to maneuver off it. The column becomes a long, vulnerable ribbon of steel. If an ambush destroys the lead vehicles and the rear vehicles simultaneously, the entire convoy is frozen. Rockets, mortars, and machine gun fire rain down from the hillsides above, and the attackers disappear back into the terrain before air support arrives. This pattern of warfare is not hypothetical military theory. Variations of it occurred repeatedly during the wars in Afghanistan and during every mountain conflict in modern history. The mountains have always favored the defender. Beyond the Zagros Mountains in the west, the Alborz Range dominates the entire northern edge of the country. Some of these peaks exceed 4,000 meters in elevation. Snow, fog, and extreme cold can ground aircraft and reduce ground movement to a crawl. Supply lines that already stretch across thousands of miles become even more fragile in these conditions. Now, imagine trying to maintain a continuous supply chain through this environment while simultaneously facing constant harassment from an enemy that knows every mountain trail and has prepared defensive positions throughout the high ground. That is not merely a tactical challenge. It becomes a strategic nightmare that consumes resources, manpower, and political will at an accelerating pace. While the military struggles with geography and logistics on the ground, an entirely separate battlefield opens back home. War is not fought only on foreign soil. It is also fought in the political arena, in the media, in the economic data, and in the streets of cities far from the fighting. If American casualties begin rising quickly, public opinion shifts rapidly and unpredictably. The experience of Vietnam showed how a war that began with broad popular support could fracture American society within a few years as the body count climbed and the promised victory never arrived. Today, the economic situation in the United States is already under significant pressure from inflation, housing costs, and stagnant wages for large parts of the working population. If the government suddenly commits trillions of dollars to a prolonged ground war in Iran, the political reaction could be explosive. Citizens would ask loudly and persistently why such enormous resources are being spent destroying a country on the other side of the world while domestic needs go unmet. The regional dimension adds another layer of complexity that planners cannot afford to ignore. Iran does not stand alone. It has developed a network of allied groups and partner organizations across the broader Middle East over several decades. If American ground forces invade Iran, those networks activate almost automatically. Missile strikes, drone attacks, and coordinated sabotage operations could target American military bases across the entire region. Shipping lanes through the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf could face sustained disruption. Energy infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, power stations could become active battlefields. The economic consequences would ripple far beyond the region, affecting global oil prices, supply chains, and financial markets in ways that would add enormous pressure on every government that had initially supported the campaign. There's also a subtler trap that often goes unexamined. Foreign militaries historically rely on local alliances and local intelligence to function effectively in unfamiliar territory. Local partners provide information about enemy movements, identify sympathetic populations, and guide operations through complex political landscapes. But those relationships are always fragile, and they become especially unreliable once local actors begin to doubt that the invading force can actually achieve its objectives. The first thing to understand is the enormous scale of the battlefield. Iran covers more than 1.6 million square kilometers of territory. That makes it larger than Iraq and Afghanistan combined. Anyone who remembers how difficult those two wars became should reflect on what that scale means for an occupation. It would mean attempting to control land that ranges from scorching deserts to towering mountain ranges, from densely populated cities to isolated rural villages, where supply roads barely exist and central authority has historically been weak. During the 20-year war in Afghanistan, American forces struggled to stabilize a country that is far smaller, far less populated, and far less militarily organized than Iran. Iran has more than 85 million citizens, a large standing military, and a deeply rooted historical memory of foreign invasions. That memory does not weaken resistance, it strengthens it. Another critical question arises before any invasion even begins. Where would the troops deploy from? Where would they land? Where would the United States build the enormous logistical infrastructure required to support such an operation? A modern army cannot simply appear in the middle of a country. Hundreds of thousands of troops must first assemble somewhere nearby, establish supply depots, fuel reserves, medical facilities, and command centers before advancing forward. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq was staged largely from Kuwait and from U.S. bases across the Persian Gulf region. Today, the political environment is dramatically different. Iraq now maintains a government with strong ties to Iran and has repeatedly stated that its territory cannot be used as a launch platform for an attack on its neighbor. If American forces attempted to stage a large-scale invasion from Iraqi soil, it could trigger major political backlash within Iraq itself, potentially destabilizing a country the United States spent decades and trillions of dollars trying to rebuild.